talk about this morning is a brief history of Lebanese resistance, which experienced many turning points along the years. In my belief, officially in Lebanon, Lebanese resistance movement was created in 1982 by several parties, one of which Lebanese Communist Party, and it's not a necessity that all these parties were leftist parties or communist or socialist. Some of them were right-wing parties, but at that time they saw fit that it is an occupation of our capital, and the only thing we can do is resist it. In our point of view, the resistance really started back in 1948, the first time the Palestinian issue broke out. And the reason of that is not classical resistance and occupation. It was a matter of displacement of a whole nation, and not only stopping in Palestine. It was a plan to displace most of the countries, the nations of most of the countries in the region. And that's when, not the whole of Lebanon, a small part of southern Lebanon where the Palestinians, they were displaced to and shuffled to, started experiencing this kind of resistance. One, because they had sympathy with a brotherhood or a neighboring nation, and between Palestine and Lebanon, especially southern Lebanon, there's always been a relationship, a family relationship, a trading relationship, because people in the south, they used to trade to Palestine, not to Beirut or to the rest of the country. So from there, we believe that with a sympathy, with a belief that this nation were slaughtered and displaced with no reason except that another nation thought that this is their promised land and they want to take it, they want to expand all over it now. So it started from then, and the people of southern Lebanon started suffering and experiencing the brutality of occupation before physically the land or their land was occupied. From bombardment, from bombing small towns and villages in southern Lebanon, which at the time there was not a proper resistance from southern Lebanon, but I know that people used to go to Palestine to fight side to side with the Palestinians, and from all over the Arabic countries, not just from Lebanon, but mainly from Lebanon. In Lebanon at the time there was a debate of the identity of our country. The government at the time, and the president in particular, they were pro-Western, pro-English and American, and they wanted this country westernized in the way they saw fit, which 50, 60 years later, the way we see it is a total control of our politics and our policies. In 1958, a small revolution, which we were discussing earlier, broke out against such a government from the same parties that a year later created a resistance. And not only because of, it wasn't a form of resisted revolution at the time, it was more of a freeing a government from a pro-Western government that did not see the country the way it should have been, an Arabic state, a state of socialism, a state of human rights, a state of socialist, not socialist, social services, and which we had none at that time. So in 1958, the revolution was a successful, and it turned over a government and President Camille Chamon at the time. From there, it didn't stop. It kept going on. The country experienced a few years of revolution. It's not exactly a revolution. It was more of freedom process and making democratic country and elections and so on. In 1968, and I think that was the very first major turning point in the Lebanese resistance history. 1968 was the start of the PLO. In 1969, an agreement in Cairo was signed between the Lebanese government and the PLO, stating or specifying a small part of southern Lebanon, which is called Arqoub. It's a few villages combined together. At that time, the Lebanese government gave a permission to the PLO to practice their resistance and their operations through what was called the Fatah land, which means Fatah is part of the PLO. Only then, and because I come from that part of the country, people started experiencing physical occupation, Israeli occupation, continuous heavily bombardment of that town. So at that time when people started not only sympathizing with the Palestinian issue, they were practicing the resistance because it became part of their daily practice because they were experiencing more and more what the Palestinians had been suffering at the time for the last 20 years of human crimes. From 1969, there was an agreement signed, yes, but this agreement was not carried out and was not respected by the Lebanese government for many reasons. Their reasons was that the PLO were mispracticing their authorities in the rest of southern Lebanon in particular and the rest of Lebanon in general. At the time, we as a party and many other parties in the what was called left movement at the time, but which, like I said before, it wasn't a totally leftist parties combined, but they were in that sort of line. That debate with the government was that, yeah, the PLO could be practicing or mispracticing some of their, or misusing some of their authorities or doing mistakes, but the big issue here is the Palestinian cause, which we think, and we've always thought, it's a just cause. It's a cause of slaughtering a whole nation without any justified reason whatsoever. And yeah, we can deal with the mistakes that the PLO practice, but we will not be driven away from the real cause and forget about it. At that time, what was known by the government since 1943, the independence. We think it was creation of a government, not a real government, which was appointed by the French colony at the time. So, in 1975, we think several staged issues was a stage. One of them in 1975 was the assassination attempt on Pierre Jumeirah. Not the late Pierre Jumeirah was assassinated last year, but his grandfather. We think it was the spark that started this 15 years of civil war. A civil war that, from one end, it was a government that was still pro-Western, and in our opinion, were dealing with Israel, which in any way, shape, or form that was not acceptable, because at that time, not at that time, we thought that Israel is occupying part of our land, is slaughtering the Palestinian people, and we will not be we will not accept our government to be dealing with the Israeli. So there was a big conflict and fight and arguments over the fact that the government should not have such a deal. In 1970, the civil war started. In 1976, we got to 1975. That sparked the civil war, and from 1975 to 1978, which was the first major and physical occupation of Israeli troops to southern Lebanon. In 1975, the attempt of assassination of Pierre Jumayel at the time resulted in a retaliation that killed more than 20 civilians, Palestinian civilians, in a civilian bus passing by eastern Beirut at the time. And from there on, the events and the action started to increase rapidly, which caused an intervention of the Syrian as well. The first, it was a combined Arabic troops, which was called at the time, but they withdrew at the end, and Syria intervened to, like Mr. Ashar said, to divide and rule. They did not intervene to stop the civil war or to stop people from fighting, but in our opinion, they intervened so they can keep the parties divided and the Lebanese people divided equally without letting any party wins or overturns the other party, and keeps the war going without winner or loser. So in our opinion, the intervention of the Syrian troops in 1976, it was a major, played a major role in the Lebanese civil war. In 1978, as I said, the first major Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon that took place, and a resolution, UN Resolution 425 was issued at the time, with demanded the immediate withdrawal of the Israeli troops from the southern Lebanon. They did withdraw, but not totally. A very small portion of that part of the country was still occupied. Another turning point that took place at the time, a part of Lebanese army troop that was sent to the south to communicate with the occupation forces, basically to be the liaison between the Lebanese government and the occupation, which took side at the time and disobeyed orders by the government, and started dealing with the occupation itself, believing that again the PLO is the reason for what the country is going through, and another strong line of resistance took place. In 1982, and between 1978 and 1982, Israel was trying everything in their power to control the PLO and the Lebanese resistance at the time from one side, and from the other side, the Syrian forces in Lebanon, in their own way, was trying as well to rule the PLO and the Lebanese resistance in a way to control them and use their this card in their negotiation on a peace process with Israel, which resulted in 1977 over a difference in opinion between the head of the Lebanese leftist resistance movement at the time, Kamal Jumblat, and the Syrian in his assassination. In 1982, after they had a strong hand in the Lebanese government, especially in the what's so-called the Christian Maronite politics policies, and in particular an assassinated president later, Bashir Jumayel, Israel decided to invade Lebanon, which they said to create a safety zone of 40 kilometers within southern Lebanon to prevent the PLO and the Lebanese resistance to do any kind of operation on the border between Lebanon and Palestine. which anyway they used the same reason in 2006 on the war with on Lebanon, telling the whole world that we want to create a safety zone that prevent Hezbollah from launching their missiles into our settlements. In 1982, the invasion did not only take place for 40 kilometers. In fact, it invaded the whole of the country in less than 24 hours. It was that easy to walk in, like everything was open up for them, except West Beirut, which took some resistance to occupy. In 1982, Bashir Jumayr was elected again in September 1982, was elected as president, which was the main ally for Washington and Israel in the country. Apparently, as things happened, that he decided, I am the president now, I'm going to demand 10,425 square kilometers is the whole landscape of the country. I don't want any foreign forces on my land, including the Syrian, the Israeli. So they felt that he had a change of hearts about the whole issue that they came into the country, and that he was assassinated. In September 1982, a formal Lebanese resistance movement was created, which worked so hard and resisted so hard as the occupation forces, the Israeli occupation forces, that the resulted the freedom of Beirut after 3 months of the occupation, and resulted further the freedom of big part of the south to the borders that they had withdrawn from in May 2005. In May 2005, a major withdrawal as a result, we think, of a continuous occupation, which the resistance between 92 and 2005 had a lot of changing and turning points along the way. The creation of Hezbollah in 1982, the heavy intervention of the Syrian forces and politics and policies, supporting one side of the resistance, which represented by Hezbollah and mainly the Shia, which is the Shia movement, and putting a whole lot of pressure on the other parties resisting, just for one reason and one reason only. Their aim was to control this resistance, to use this resistance to their best interest, and use it in every possible way in their negotiation with the peace process with Israel. After 2005, after 2000, the total withdrawal of Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, and except Shebas farms, which we thought at that time resistance was taking an extreme measures and misusing the great victory of 2000 in the form that the resistance was happening in Shebas farms. As Mr. Asher said, in 2005, Mr. Khalil was assassinated. Syrian troops who had to withdraw. Many UN resolution was invented, and in 2006 the war was raided on Lebanon under for the reasons or the targets of the war, or the reasons of the war were the kidnapping of 2 Israeli soldiers, which everyone knows that was only an excuse, and the war was pre-prepared way before 2006, July 2006, and it was just waiting for a reason to happen, and the kidnapping of the soldiers were only a small portion of that. The war and the targets that Israel put for the war, the disarmament of Hezbollah, the setback of Hezbollah at least to that safety zone we spoke, to the north of Litani River, so they cannot launch their missiles on Israel. Every single target the war or Israel had appointed for the war, they failed to to achieve. Yeah, Lebanon was distracted over a massive 33 days of war, a very destructive and human-killing 33 days of war. But in our opinion, in everyone's opinion, in Washington's opinion, in Israel themselves' opinion, that they lost the war because they could not achieve any of their targets, except, unfortunately, a few American and few Washington's allies inside Lebanon, inside the Lebanese government. They think we lost the war and it was a disastrous on all levels, including the targets that Israel has set up for the war. Unfortunately, but we think it was a victory. It was a victory for many reasons. One of which, for the first time, Israel is defeated. This whole myth of Israeli forces and Israeli army forces in the Arabic world and in the open Arabic-Israeli conflict since 1948, it was realistic, really and in reality defeated in every way. In 1982, as we said, they occupied the capital. In 2006, they could not occupy a very small village, Maroun al-Ras, in southern Lebanon, for more than a couple of hours. So, in our opinion, Israel was defeated big time in Lebanon, and in everyone's opinion, except few of our politicians. Unfortunately, this victory, and for the very, very, very religious reasons, it did not last in Lebanon, and it's lost in many ways inside the inside politics of Lebanon, between opposition and governments, between changing governments, between changing the prime minister or expanding the government with 2-3 ministers more or less for this party or the other. Again, in our opinion, we think we lost the victory. We won it in a war with Israel, but we lost it in our internal politics big time. Basically because none of the parties that is having the conflict inside Lebanon have a clear and an open vision of a democratic and a modernized government that everyone is dream of. Therefore, we as a party, and one of the very rare parties at the moment, we are not sided by any of the two sides of opposition or the government in Lebanon, because in our opinion, after what's happened, after all these years in Lebanon, after the war, after a victory that we've always wanted and we have achieved, we do not want to lose such a victory in our internal minor politics, and which is not going to get us the democratic states that we've always dreamt of. Thank you very much. Okay.